This is a summary of White Sargasso Sea by Jean Rice. Okay, so the book was written in 1965. It is a post-colonial response to Charlotte Bronte's novel Jane Eyre. This book is about a girl named Antoinette. Are you ready? Okay, so book, three parts. One, Antoinette as a sad little girl. Part two, Antoinette as an angry, older lady who is not really old, but an angry young lady, okay? And also part two, this British guy who marries Antoinette for her money. And part three is Antoinette as a crazy, insane person who lives in an attic. And the book talks about the relationship between men and women romantically in the colonial era. Yeah. And it also goes into class, color, and gender and how they affect the perception of different people and the perception of Antoinette, who is seen as other. No matter where she is at, in Jamaica, in Dominica, in England, she is always seen as other. She's not black, she's not white, she is other. I mean, she might be, but whatever. So, part one is Antoinette's childhood. She lives with her mom and her brother named Pierre and these servants, and everyone hates them because they're white and they used to own slaves. Not really just because they're white, just because they used to own slaves and they used to be rich and whatever. Part two, Antoinette is forced into marriage with this guy named Mr. Rochester, who is not actually named Mr. Rochester in White Sargasso Sea, but whatever. So, during this part, Mr. Rochester is all like, we're married now, and I'm going to call you Bertha because I don't like your mom's name, and I want your money. And Mr. Rochester pretty much hates everything about Antoinette, everything about her background, her identity of being a Creole woman, an identity of being Caribbean. He hates that. He just likes England. England is his city, alright? And Christophine, her trusty caretaker, is all like, leave him. But no. And the book ends in part three with a change of voice and a realization of self from Antoinette, who is now a crazy lady Bertha. It ends with her burning down Mr. Rochester's mansion place and jumping off of it and just killing herself because she realizes that she is no longer herself and that the only way to release herself from the clutches of Mr. Rochester is to kill herself. And that is White Sargasso Sea in a nutshell. Please read the book. It is good.
The poem Sympathy by Paul Laurence Dunbar explains a feeling of being bound by a force that you cannot control. The caged bird is helpless, lost in a world that no other can save it from. It flaps and tries to fly, but cannot escape. It bleeds, and old wounds reopen as it tries to get away from its own personal hell. As it gains freedom, it cries and pleads. With the author's understanding of finally being set free from an awful torment, he knows why the caged bird sings.
Now, we're going to take a short look at the underlying themes that seem to stretch across and connect Bronte's Jane Eyre, Rice's White Sargasso Sea, and the short poem Sympathy. Each section of the poem appears to give a general summative of each transition throughout both of the novels we read. One might see the reference of the caged bird as a comparison to Jane during her time living with her cruel aunt and cousins as a youth, or her time at Lowood. It could also be seen as Antoinette and her mother being trapped on the island of Coulbry, or in Spanish Town amongst those who despise them. It could even be later related to Antoinette's fate, trapped in Mr. Rochester's attic in both White Sargasso Sea and Jane Eyre. The beginnings of this poem, though, starts off sweet and hopeful. This is a phase that takes place in both stories. Annette's mother became hopeful when she was briefly rescued by her new husband, Mr. Mason. Antoinette had a short-lived delight in the beginnings of her marriage to Mr. Rochester, and Jane, in Jane Eyre, at first could not anticipate her arrival at the Lowood School for Girls. And lastly, Jane was excited at the prospect of spending her life with Mr. Rochester at Thornfield. In the final parts of the poem, we see that the poor caged bird has reached its breaking point, hysterically beating its bloody, bruised wings against the cold, hard cage. This symbolizes the impatience and later insanity characterized in both Jane Eyre and White Sargasso Sea. Not only did Annette beg and beg and beg to move her family and Mr. Mason to England near the beginning of the story, but Antoinette also became anxious to leave Spanish Town during her time with Mr. Rochester. Unfortunately, we can all recall how manic and hysterical she gets when she, a caged bird herself, is doomed to a lifetime in the confined space of Edward Rochester's attic. And as for Jane, she reaches her tipping point with all the mysteries and omissions in the novel, finally realizing that there was a crazy woman in the attic. Of course, ignorant Jane returns her hand to Playboy Rochester in the end, but you can't win them all. And that's the story of the caged birds in Jane Eyre, White Sargasso Sea, and Sympathy.